Sorry. Great. Hello, everyone. Sorry we're a little bit late. We might go over till about 2:05, if that's all right, so that we can still have a good hour together. I'm Matthew Taylor. I'm the Chief Executive of the RSA. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here for today's special lunchtime event. Is this the last one of our year? Okay, so I always do this to embarrass my events team. This is the last event of our year, so we've done about 110 brilliant events across the year. Our events team are absolutely amazing. They put on all this program. Many of you will have been to other RSA events, so just before we start, I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking the RSA events team for another wonderful year. Good. Thank you. Before we begin, can you turn your mobile phone to silent? We're filming today and live streaming over the web, which is why I was not allowed to wear my comedy Christmas jumper for this event. So welcome to everyone joining us online. The hashtag is RSA 2016, if you'd like to get involved in the conversation on Twitter. So fittingly, for our last public event in 2016, we've gathered an expert panel to help us review what has been an extraordinary year. The Brexit vote, the Trump presidency, the tragic continuation of conflict, terror, migration, war. 2016 has been a year of unpredictability, of anxiety, of unrest, and often of anger. And I don't suspect many of us think that 2017 is going to be a return to business as usual. Each of our reviewers today is a distinguished academic, and so is used to contextualizing the events of history and seeing them with a long view perspective. So to help us understand the year and to distinguish, as they say, the signal from the noise, we're delighted to be joined by Matthew Goodwin, who's a political scientist specializing in British and European politics, extremism, immigration, and Euroscepticism. He's currently Professor of Politics at the University of Kent and Senior Visiting Fellow at Chatham House. His 2015 book, Revolt on the Right, was the Paddy Power Political Book of the Year. I can even hold it up. There it is. Sarah Churchwell is Professor of American Literature and Chair of Public Understanding of the Humanities at the University of London's School of Advanced Study. Sarah writes widely across culture and politics, appears regularly as a commentator on television and radio, and she's the award-winning author. Her most recent book is Careless People, Murder, Mayhem, and the Invention of the Great Gatsby. Peter Frankopan is Senior Research Fellow at Worcester College, Oxford, and Director of the Centre for Byzantine Research at Oxford University. Is it Byzantine or Byzantine? Byzantine or Byzantine? What is?
We've got more interesting things to talk about.
Which one is it?
I think Byzantine.
Byzantine, okay.
Byzantine for our American friends.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Centre for Byzantine Research, Oxford University. His university claimed an award-winning book, The Silk Roads, which I'm actually currently reading at home, and it's great. A New History of the World was named by Berliner Zeitung as not just the most important history book in years, but the most important in decades. So the way we're going to structure things is that each of our speakers, in the order that I've introduced them, is going to lead for about 5, 6, 7 minutes, no more than 7 minutes, on a particular area of expertise that they've got. Then the other two panelists are going to respond for a couple of minutes, and then if there's time, we're going to bring you in. So we're going to talk about, first of all, Brexit, secondly, Trump, and then thirdly, instability in the world, geopolitics, what's kind of going on in terms of how the world is changing and the ways in which we can learn from history about that. So I will do my best to bring you in at various points over the hour. So first of all, I'm going to turn to Matthew to talk to us about Brexit and how we should understand. I think there's a broad view that your analysis of Brexit is the most kind of sophisticated. So kind of tell us what your analysis is of why Brexit happened, and also what we need to learn from it, and also what you think might happen next in 7 minutes, starting from now.
Well, let me start with a very brief story. We set down to write that book in 2013, and we wanted to look at how British society is changing, long-term social change. And the one thing basically that we discovered was that certain social groups were feeling incredibly marginalised, not only economically but also culturally. They're holding a set of values that were very different from what you might call the liberal mainstream set of values, and they were very dissatisfied with the way in which our politics were responding to them. Fast forward to the beginning of 2014, and we had the luxury of going into the Labour Party to present the research to Ed Miliband and his team. Didn't get it. Just didn't get it. Didn't think it was an issue, didn't think the rise of a new Eurosceptic party was an issue, thought it was hurting the Conservatives, said, well, look, actually, we're making arguments about cost of living, economics, wages, jobs. These will cut through. Fast forward to the 2015 general election. Of course, Labour goes to its third lowest number of seats since 1935. Big loss of working class voters. Fast forward to the referendum, nearly 70% of Labour constituencies voted for Brexit. And you begin to actually see the real hemorrhaging of support away from not only from Labour but also the mainstream among voters who for around 30 years have felt as though the economic transformation of Britain has not really been very beneficial to them, but also the cultural transformation of Britain has not been very comfortable or what they wanted. So then when you drill down and you look at the dynamics of the Brexit vote, you really see this long-term social change playing out. And Brexit, what happened in 2016 is interesting, but what it actually did was give full expression to these much deeper divides that have been building in Britain and most other Western democracies for many years. And so we are left as a country that essentially is divided along three lines. We're divided by social class, we're divided by generation, we're also divided by geography, political geography as well. And I struggle to see how we're now actually going to reconcile some of those divides, because so much of it is about more than just this sort of transactional economic debate that we're having nationally about, well, the single market's good for us, therefore we should stay as close as possible and we should accept free movement, when we know that the voters who delivered Brexit are thinking about this in a far more diffuse lens of identity, of perceived threats to values, ways of life and the national community. And they've also shown themselves, not only in the UK but also the US, to be now politically mobilised. Around 2.5 million extra voters turned out on polling day that we didn't really anticipate in the polls. And they're highly committed, and they're now likely to remain highly committed to the political process to ensure that their vision of Brexit is one that is enacted. And I think that has forced all of us to rethink. It's forced pollsters to rethink the way they model. It's forced academics to think, are we talking to the right people? Are we using the right methodologies? Because our surveys, to be frank, weren't great on a lot of this stuff. And it's also, forcing politics to think more broadly about the way in which they communicate with different social groups. So I sort of wanted to be optimistic about where we are. I'm actually quite pessimistic, because when I look at the mainstream now, I say the political mainstream, I'm not really hearing much that is going to get us into a more unified place. I'm hearing a lot of the same arguments, the same narratives that we heard before the 2015 general election, before the referendum. Labour's saying this is transactional resource politics. Conservatives are pitching to their traditional base, and there isn't much that's pushing the argument forward. So I'm pessimistic in terms of where we are now.
When I was, a few weeks ago, I was at a conference, and one of the other speakers was a kind of uber cosmopolitan liberal public intellectual. And he was delighted because on that day, the court ruling came through.
Right, yeah.
And I said to him, don't you see that this is disastrous? Because this just reframes the whole issue as the elite versus the public. This was before the Daily Mail headline. And so that was a moment for me of kind of pessimism, because it felt as though the way in which a lot of Remainers have responded to Brexit is almost calculated to increase the sense amongst Leavers that there is a kind of liberal establishment disdain for them and an attempt, as it were. And I was talking to Mattinson that she'd done some polling, and she found that people are even more disenchanted than they were before. And also there is a very strong sense amongst people out there that there is something fishy going on, that there is an attempt to stand in the way of what it is they voted for. And this is a kind of dangerous feeling.
I think even before the referendum, if you looked at, say, the British social attitudes data, and you just looked at working class respondents, the percentage who said people in government don't speak for people like me reached its record height 2 years before the referendum. So we sort of knew there was a really strong sense of disenchantment, dissatisfaction. The gamble, essentially, that the middle class elite made was that those voters wouldn't turn out. I was doing some polling on the day of the referendum, and let me tell you, we had people outside a lot of polling stations. Brexit was 7 points ahead by 10 a.m. Those groups could not wait to get out. It was almost as if, this had been, they've been waiting for 20 years, and then the option was, do I vote for Brexit or do I go to the garden centre? And they voted en masse for Brexit. And I think the problem, and a friend said this to me recently, the issue is that we've become incredibly scared about talking to these questions of culture, identity, and also academics have been very bad at understanding the power of emotion in political mobilization, because you can't really operationalize it. You can't put a nice question on a survey that gets at these things. You're talking about betrayal, you're talking about loss, you're talking about how people respond to that in terms of what they're witnessing in their communities. I think that is where we need to do a lot of more research, because the effects of this are going to carry on playing out for many, many years to come.
Sarah, you're going to be talking about Trump. So you can't be superior to us as an American, but what you can do is you can reflect. You can reflect on us. What did Brexit? How do you perceive the state of this country now as an outsider to an extent, and the British psyche? What do you think is kind of going on for us?
Well, I'm less and less of an outsider as every day goes by. I've lived here for 17 years now, and
go for three more, and we'll count you in.
Thank you very much. And I became a British citizen earlier this year.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. It had not occurred to me when I did that I might someday be seeking the shelter of Her Majesty from my own government, but we'll come on to that later. No, all kidding aside, it was I will be very frank and say that was a difficult decision for me to take, and not the looming prospect of Brexit as such, because I was among those who didn't really think it would happen. And paint me a liberal metropolitan elite if you want. Probably all of those things apply in whatever ways you might think they do. But I didn't think it would happen. But one could see the writing on the wall in terms of the attitude toward people who weren't born here. And I have had this conversation a lot, because I have found it has felt significant to me and important to me in the way that the debate about immigration happens here, for me to keep pointing out to people that I too am an immigrant. Not in order to suggest that I too am a victim, because it has been very, very easy for me to move here. It was very, very easy for me to move here. But precisely because when people say that this is an argument about immigrants taking jobs and not an argument about xenophobia, I have to say that has not been my experience. Because I did take a job from a British person, and nobody has ever objected to it. But by definition, I did. But I'm a native speaker, and my name is English sounding, and and all of those things. So my own personal, anecdotal, and emotional experience, and I think Matthew's point about emotion is extremely important here, has been that it is easier for people like me to do this. But there was a turning tide of resentment, and one could feel it, and one worried about one's legal status in the country, and I just thought I need to be sure that I am a part of this legally, and then you have to have the really serious emotional, personal questions with yourself, your family, your loved ones about who you are and whether this is an identity that you embrace, and whether you don't want to just do it for technical or cynical reasons. But so for me, it was a very, very complicated emotional thing to do, and then Britain went and voted Brexit, which didn't make me feel very happy about the whole thing. So I'll come out and say, I think it's hopefully one of the advantages of being an academic, right, is that I don't have to pretend to be a neutral journalist, right? And I think it's important to the point about emotion and perspective that we all be honest about where we come from and not try to kind of evade various issues. So my perspective on where things are is that I agree that, and I would, if I can dare say from the point of view of an outsider, I don't think the British have ever been famed for their ability at talking about emotions. And this is a particularly emotionally laden issue. I think I would use another word as well, which is that we as a society, an Anglo-American culture, have really struggled lately to talk about values in a constructive way, in a way that isn't finger-pointing, that isn't doubling down and digging in your heels and demonizing the other, but is finding ways to say, what are our common values? Where do we come together? Which isn't necessarily to say, and this will come to this with Trump, I'm sure, too, that you have to empathize with people or that kind of argument, but rather to just say, what do we have in common? What are we trying to build? What is the nature of this democracy? What is the nature of this society? And it is incumbent upon both sides to try to find a way forward in that conversation. I feel like some of the stuff about the elite versus, the Remainers versus the Brexiters and the assumption that the Remainers are elitist, there becomes a kind of reverse snobbery, which is as if that position must also be discounted, and we must only consider the emotions of the people who voted to leave, and it's as if we're being held hostage to a certain set of emotions, and other kinds of emotions are being discounted. And so what I'd like to do is to find a way for everybody to say there are strong emotions on both sides, there are strong values on both sides. Where is the common ground? How do we find it? How do we rebuild it? I am a committed centrist. I don't know how else you deal with polarized sides and hold the center together rather than shore up your center ground. Part of the problem, and I'll stop now, I know I'm doing 5 minutes on Brexit instead of on Trump, but is that the centrist ground was taken over by a set of neoliberal policies that people are rejecting on both sides of the aisle. So we also have to find a different way to envision how centrism might function politically and in terms of policy. Sorry, that was much longer
No, it's
than
great.
you wanted.
But Peter, this notion that Sarah's talking about the centre cannot hold, as it were,
But it has to hold.
In your book, one of the interesting, fascinating things about reading your book is that because you've truncated so much history from so many parts of the world, is that almost as soon as you describe a nation or an empire in the ascendancy, you're describing its decline and the fissures within it. So this characteristic that I guess we're going to be talking about, which is of a kind of deep cultural divide within societies which also face profound external challenges and internal challenges. Is there anything to give us hope? Is there? Can you dredge up from your times which have felt as bad as this, where something has a unifying force, someone has come forward and managed to reunite people?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, the answer is yes and no. I mean, in fact, with these kinds of things, the stage is set for a leader who is able to provide a vision and a plan and to be a leader, and that's what we're all waiting for. And for whatever reasons, the problems in the Labour Party, the problems in the Conservative Party, the structure of our Parliament right now, it doesn't look like there's anybody on the national political stage who's able to explain what is going on, what is in store, that has credibility. And all of the people involved here who either are in leadership positions or work for people who are in leadership positions recognise that a good leader is able to be honest about what the difficulties are ahead and don't try and pull the wool over your eyes, and they try and explain a rational way out of this. And that is a real worry. I suppose, adding to the pessimism, the point about division, I only add to Matthew that those divisions go through many more than your three headline factors. We all know things like gender, the fact that women aren't paid at the same level that men are, racial discrimination, the increasing amount of residential racial segregation that we have in this country and the developed world as a whole. The House of the West, the United States, Europe, look divided. And as a historian, looking back at this long period of history, it looks to me that we're on the Titanic and it's sinking. The West, the sun is setting, full stop. The question is how quickly or slowly that happens. My own view about Brexit is in the long run, we're still going to be in the icy water and it's game over. Probably on balance, if you've all seen Titanic, you're better off, Kate Winslet and DiCaprio would have been better off getting in that lifeboat than trying to both be on the door. But that profile of worries about elites, worries about migration, questions about values, lack of leadership, the navel-gazing, is one that are the classic signs of the disintegration of sunset in any period, in any region over history. Those existential questions about how do we work out who we are, how do we find a way through this. There can be moments when an inspirational leader emerges from the gloom, and so you can't, as a historian, you learn to respect, you can't guess how the future is going to emerge. But the fundamentals of where we are in the world today is that the West is falling and dying. It has to, because of demographics, because of industrial production, because of GDP, because of standards of living, because of our costs. And the East is rising. And it's just a question of calibrating that speed.
Matthew, I want to bring you back to respond to those comments. But before I do, let's just take two or three. And I'm particularly keen to hear from anyone who's got any hope. Yes. Let's have a little word of hope here. But keep your comments short and sharp if you can.
Thank you so much. I'm with Peter. And I think Brexit is a wonderful... I'm a migrant. I grew up amongst migrants, and so I'd always considered myself a global citizen. And whatever country I worked and lived in, I contributed to massively. And I now feel that I'm just waiting for Mrs. May to throw me out after 30 plus
I'm not
years.
hearing the hope yet.
No, you're not. Well, you see, I was sort of global, as a global citizen, I had a place in the world. And Brexit is a wonderful distraction with what's happening in the Middle East. I grew up amongst people from the Yemen and the Lebanon and Syria. And so, no, it's not hope. I think you're absolutely right when talking about, you know, civilizations do die. I lived in Rome. I lived in Lucca. Lucca once had an empire, and so did Venezia.
Okay.
So,
thanks for lifting our spirits. Do you want to pass the microphone here, and then we'll take one other comment and I'll bring you back in, Matthew. If you could tell us your name, it would be great, brother.
My name's Tom Dennis. What I'd like to hear from you is whether you think, I mean, I've heard, Peter, you say there isn't one, but where is there a leader? Because we have a political system which is also, I think, already dead. And there's all these people who are grappling around trying to make it live. But it has already died. It's so hard to touch. I mean, this country really, really needs a leader who can create a new system of some sort. I think behind which an awful lot of people, particularly the sort of the Bernie Sanders type thinking people, would follow. So, can you think of one?
In one word, yeah.
One has to recognise that half the, well, give or take half the electorate in this country and in the States did see that leader. Their leader is someone who did speak to define a vision and explain a set of solutions. Now, we'll argue about, well, no, we won't argue, I'm sure we'll agree that the solutions proposed are catastrophic, but the fact of identifying what is wrong is what got Brexit through and what got Trump through. And there is fundamental truth in what Trump and what Brexit was about.
Yeah. Finally, very briefly. Oh.
There is a hope, and hope is that fix our economy. If we can fix the national economy, the world economy, yes, we can get together again. But again, it's easier said than done, of course. Thank you.
Okay, right. We feel like a room ready for a kind of messianic leader, which is not necessarily a kind of good state of mind to be in, and particularly for this audience, you know.
I think what's really interesting is actually...
Well, I am thinking about myself. No, go on.
It's sort of everybody seems to be converging on the role of agency, not structure and demand, and that's quite interesting because the debate is often about, you know, the left behind and how the economic system has marginalised certain groups and how the foundations are shifting. But what I'm hearing is actually agency is what's going to save the West, whether that's in the form of a new leader or a new movement or a new party. I mean, if I was just to spin this, the 30-second hope version of this discussion is actually all the populists in the West are being forced to operate within democratic frameworks. Support for democracy is still very high. Public interest in politics is still very high. Groups that have historically...
I saw a graph yesterday.
No, is this about millennials?
Yeah, not being democratic.
That is an inaccurate graph that I would suggest. Pippa Norris and the monkey cage has pulled that graph to pieces, and I encourage you to look at the monkey cage, which is linked to Washington Post.
Right, good.
That's inaccurate.
Okay.
But groups that historically have been leaving the political process have been coming back to the political process, whether in terms of older white working class voters in the US and Brexit, or whether in terms of economically disaffected groups. They've been coming back into politics. And yeah, sure, I mean, you know, shocker, liberal elite in London doesn't like it, right? Or doesn't like the view. But there is a silver lining to Brexit, which is that actually if you believe in a sort of pluralist conception of democracy, the marketplace of ideas where everybody brings something to the table, then what happened in 2016 is good for liberal democracy. It means that actually we have a diversity of opinion and we have issues and demands on the table that we need to think about and talk about. There's a hope version.
That's good. So, Sarah. No, we're pondering. So, Sarah, you didn't think Brexit was going to happen. It did happen. Did you think Trump was going to happen?
Of course not.
Right.
Of course I didn't.
And how should we, there's a kind of common understanding, which is that to understand Brexit, if you had to choose one thing, it would be economics. But if you had to understand Trump, you chose one thing, it would have to be culture. Is that a correct reading?
Well, I think This is going to get semantic very quickly, but I think culture is too broad a church to answer that question. I think that if I had to choose one word to explain Trump, I would say media. And I mean all kinds of media and all kinds of things that are implicated in the word media, including the fact that in America, all political coverage is for profit, which was a massively important factor in Trump. But I think there are all kinds of things that we need, obviously, that factored in to Trump's success. I was asked not too long ago, in fact 2 days after the election, to explain how Trump got elected, and I started in good academic way to say, well, there were myriad factors. You have to think about the media, and you have to think about resentment, and then I suddenly said, actually no, 2 words: he lied. And I think that's a really important part. He lied. He set out a vision. It was totally untrue, but they liked the vision. So that matters. I think that in terms of to think about Trump in terms of the points that we've already raised, though, I think can be useful, which is both the question of history and the question of hope. So I'm still struggling to come to terms with Trump's election, not because I didn't like it, not because I don't like his party. I didn't like the fact that George W. Bush won. What's happened with Trump is transformative in a very, very different way. And I think most people recognize that. This is not a question of my party not getting in. This is a question of all of the democratic institutions of America being very clearly and very aggressively under threat right now by somebody who is very clearly a kleptocrat. And that is a very serious situation, and he does not seem to be being held to account by the Congress that is sworn to uphold the Constitution and to stop this from happening. We're supposed to have checks and balances. That doesn't seem to be happening. Some people think that the GOP is waiting to impeach him on day one over the emoluments clause, which he said he's going to be in breach of, in order that they can install Pence because they would prefer Pence. Who knows? I couldn't tell you what is in the GOP's head right now, because I can't believe that they're making the decisions that they're making, except that they're very clearly, in my view, putting party above nation in a way that I find totally despicable, above world in a way that I find despicable. So that's my fear. Those are my worries. But when I look at history, I find a little bit of reason for hope. As you mentioned, I wrote a book about The Great Gatsby, and in 1920, America, Gatsby, of course, the great novel of the 20s, and The American Dream. In 1920, America voted in its first businessman president on a platform, America First. He was called Warren G. Harding. That phrase might sound familiar because Trump used it too. And America First was eventually used by Lindbergh in the anti-Semitic campaigns in the late 1930s. Warren G. Harding was a friend of businessmen, of business, and at the same time it was an anti-immigration, it was an isolationist, nativist movement. There was a huge spike in the KKK and in hate crime in the 20s during his administration and in the administrations that followed him. 2 more businessmen followed him, Coolidge. He, by the way, stopped being president because he died of a heart attack during the biggest corruption scandal in the 20th century American political history, the Teapot Dome scandal. His vice president, Coolidge, took over, also friendly to business, and then Hoover took over, friendly to business, and in 1929, Wall Street crashed. At that point, America in the 1930s started having conversations that are uncannily like the ones that are being had now, in exactly the ways that Peter was describing a minute ago. Who are we? Can we put our house in order? And they absolutely were saying that democracy had failed. It was over. The American experiment was over, and it had been shown that it would not work. And then Roosevelt was elected and rebuilt it. And he was building the welfare state at the same time that Britain was building its welfare state. The war helped. The military-industrial complex helped. So I'm not suggesting that there is an easy solution here. But I am suggesting that history shows us, and certainly this is obviously modern history in a snapshot. The long view may well still be that Roosevelt was a blip on a long decline. And I wouldn't dispute that until we see where the graph ends up. But if we zoom in on it, there are still dips and troughs to come. So can we rise out of this? Yes, we can. Can we rebuild? Yes, we can. And I think that, this is Obama. God, I'm like channeling Obama. But I think that we also have to remember the way the American political system works. 65 to, I think we're at 66 now, million Americans voted for Hillary. More people than ever voted for any white man in history. Although I have to say, nobody has yet pointed out that's because there are more Americans than there ever were before, which I keep thinking must be part of the equation.
I read it yesterday.
Okay, good. Somebody finally. I was like, isn't that really the reason why? I'm not a statistician, but I suspect that might be in there somewhere. But anyway, it's important, and those people are very, very angry, and those people are very angry at what Trump is doing, regardless of whether the Republicans hold him to account. And we have a little thing called midterm elections, 2 years. So one of the big questions is what happens if the Americans who did not want Trump in push back. I don't know the answer to that question, but the game's not over yet.
So can I ask? So when I was in the States about a week ago, I kind of sensed talking to the people I spoke to were kind of weren't Trump enthusiasts. There was a kind of ambivalence. There was one response, which is, well, he's the president now. We have to forget the past. We have to hope he's going to be better than we thought. And we just have to, as it were, try and hold him to account on the assumption that he's now, as president, going to run the country as you should run the country as president, versus people who sound a bit more like you, which is, he's a lying bastard and, you know, we've got to fight him. What do you think, is that the kind of choice that people face? Am I misportraying you in saying that your position is
No,
continue
that's a
to...
very fair statement of my position.
Right. So you think there's no... Do you think it's incredible, those people who say, whatever I think of him, he is now our president and we must now give him the benefit of the doubt?
No, I don't think it's incredible at all, and I admire them in one sense. I think the problem is that, and this is why Trump keeps winning, is that people are behaving in a reasonable manner towards somebody who is behaving unreasonably. And to continue to do that is a kind of definition of madness. So they still want to play by the old rules, as if you know it's okay. He'll become like everybody else eventually. Well, so far there's zero evidence of that. And every time we thought he would do that, he didn't do it. He's broken every single rule except the ones that suited him. So he's an opportunist, very, very clearly. As soon as I see him start to do any of those swings to normality or swings to or any kind of acknowledgement of the fact that he also is a subject of the rule of law, is actually that there are democratic processes and principles to which he is supposed to be held accountable. But he clearly thinks that he's unaccountable. Now, I don't actually think that he doesn't have plans, and I do think he's a loose cannon firing at will, but there are clearly things he wants to achieve. And you asked me to say in a word what it was that got him there. In a word, what he wants to achieve is money. In a word, what he wants to achieve is power. That's very, very clear. We can all see the narcissism and all of that stuff. But he's very, very erratic and unpredictable in the way that plays out. And so the idea that we can trust this guy to play nice, I find deeply, deeply naive. And so it's not that I don't respect their attempt to try to return to some level of civility. I want civil discourse. I was arguing for it a minute ago. We need it. But can you have civil discourse with somebody who's a tyrant who's screaming his head off and saying that he's going to lock up his opponents? I'm not sure civil discourse is the way to go.
So Peter, what does history tell us about how people who get power on a populist ticket manage to continue to be popular? I mean, I guess the sense is that he has a choice. He either goes respectable and loses a lot of his support, or else he tries to run the country as he's run his campaign, in which case things could get much, much worse. If he was looking through history, what tips would he get?
Well, I think we were talking a little bit about it beforehand. I think this idea that Trump is the first politician who's learned how to play the media and stay in the spotlight and detract attention by change is crazy. I mean, that shows the narrowness of the goldfish bowl that we swim around, worrying about how 2016 and this is somehow awful. I mean, I think that you have to judge on actions. I mean, I suppose to Matthew's point, it is right that the more people engaged in public debate, the higher the levels of accountability. And there are passions running through the media, the social media is changing the way in which the ability and the speed at which people communicate, that Trump will have to be judged on his actions. And it's, of course, in nobody's interests, not just in the States, in this room, all over the world, for Trump to make short-term, narrow-minded, dangerous decisions. And I think we have to distinguish between the fear of what, well, and Sarah's probably right, is quite likely to happen between hoping that the wind catches in the best possible way. And the problem is going to be Trump's ability to deliver what he's promised, and how is he able to explain that as and when the jobs don't come back to Detroit quickly enough, or the types of issues with Black Lives Matters, or the types of profiling, the types of all the sort of problems that we all can see in the States. Is where do you start? It's when those don't get solved quickly enough. And there is a danger, I think, when there's higher levels of public engagement, is that it's quite easy for a leader to shut down and become more autocratic. So I think we are in slightly uncharted territories with Trump. There has been in the last month, it's very hard to read the signals of what kind of Trump he's going to be. And he's surrounded himself by very rich, white, so-called alpha males, which is,
With a remarkable record of domestic abuse among them, as a matter of fact.
Well, okay, I mean, yeah, there we go. And nothing surprises me in 2016, but if I was here in 1016, nothing would surprise me either. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that the more worrying thing, I mean, the only 2 points I pick up on what Sarah is that, the truth is, and I should have made a distinction between the United States and Europe. The United States has got pieces of the puzzle that can be corrected and can put steam back in the engine. We are in the West, Europe, and in the States remarkably resilient, and that we have quite a good record of getting through these problems. We can talk about Hitler in the 30s too much and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, but we have been quite good at finding ways of talking. The worry is that what really did pick the American economy up and put America center stage, and what picks all economies up, is military conflict. And that is something that goes back 3,000 years. You can see leaders who are distracted, they create the volume for their businesses, they create explanations for why there is suffering, they get people out of the factories and onto the front lines. And those kind of models, we are fools if we think that the only people who commit acts of violence are in Yemen or Aleppo, particularly in the continent of Europe.
We were talking before, Matthew, about this question of, is 2017 the year of betrayal, as people realise that Brexit doesn't give them what they want, that Trump... So what do you think happens when populism fails?
Yeah, I think we're having this interesting debate about post-liberalism. I think we're going to go into a parallel debate about post-populism, and what I mean by that is what happens when populists don't deliver. And if you look at the Brexit debate and the Trump debate, there's a sort of an assumption running through both of them. When the Rust Belt realises that Trump is not going to revive it, they will go back to the Democrats. When Brexit voters realise that hard Brexit is economically damaging, they're going to go back to the mainstream. There is an alternative hypothesis, which is that actually they just become more angry, more frustrated, and they blame the elite, whether it's the EU, whether it's Washington, for failing to sustain their living standards. And that is my criticism of social democracy at the moment. And when I listen to Brits, but also my American colleagues talking about Trump, here's my worry. There's a similarity between the Democrats, between the Labour Party and progressives on the continent, which is they are now talking a hell of a lot more about the faults in their opponents than their own intellectual project. And my concern for the progressive left is that they are losing on that battle quite heavily on the issues of identity, migration, culture, values. And unless they start saying what they're for rather than what they're against, even if it's a narcissistic maniac, they're not going to be in the game.
Literally a couple of comments from the room, because we'll take these three, but make them really quick because I've got so little time. Yeah.
Perhaps we're not looking for a new leader, but we're looking for a new plan and a new vision and a new deal and a new Marshall Plan. And I would like to just draw in what happened this year at COP22 in Marrakesh. I was in the American Pavilion the morning of the Trump election, and there was a big down, but there was a huge global upswelling, and a new declaration came out of Marrakesh that we must do this because the physics trumps the politics.
Yeah. And then that.
I read Peter's book about a year ago, and it gave me huge hope, and I sort of felt confident that we were going to have all these traumas with Trump and Brexit, etc. But the issue for me is that apathy is over, and we're now engaged in debate where we were stuck in apathy.
Okay. And then finally?
Do you think Trump was the first Machiavellian president?
No.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, now, Peter...
You're the worst, but not the first.
Peter, what's going on geopolitically in the world? I mean, let's just start with one moment, if that's right, which is President Assad holding out an olive branch to President Trump and saying, let's put this behind us and start all over. So I just take that moment of influence, what that moment could represent, and from that, tell us how to understand what's going on in the world.
Well, that's 7 minutes, hey? Okay. I think part of our problem is when we have the sort of concept of spatial geography, we think of Britain, Brexit, we spent a long time on that, Europe, and the United States, and then the rest of the world. And when we think about the rest of the world, we sort of start with Aleppo, say Yemen, and that's kind of it. There's 70% of the world's population live between Istanbul and Shanghai. And there is the trauma of Aleppo and of Syria specifically to talk about. I'd have thought the most useful and interesting 2 points are first that it doesn't look like the mechanisms set up by the international community, whether it's through the UN or other agencies, are, I hate the word fit for purpose, you'll have hated it as well, but they don't work. That's clear. And second, the sort of absolute inability for anybody outside that region to make successful intervention apart from Tehran and Moscow. And 2 years ago, we had MPs fist pumping that we weren't going to intervene in Syria. And now it's all about how we did too little, too late, and browbeating and so on. We are very bad at reacting correctly. We react emotionally, and we react to events as they're unfolding without ever stopping to think maybe we should work backwards from the solutions. So when William Hague decided to intervene in Libya and announced that it was time that Gaddafi should go, that whole idea of how we misread the Arab Spring, how we misread the world around us, well, that happens when you don't educate people. And here in this building, within the RSA, it's all, and you can't have enlightenment if you don't have expertise. And the idea that politicians turn on experts and turn on academics, the greatest single problem facing our country and where we're slipping behind the rest of the world, in fact, this morning in the reports, is the quality of the primary and secondary education that we provide for our children. And that makes a civilization and its culture and its sciences and everything around us grow. So in most of the parts of the world that I work on, 2016 has been a terrific year. Growth has carried on. People are talking about how do they cooperate closer and better together. In Iran, there's a sense that Iran is being welcomed back into the family of nations, whether Trump decides to, as well, in fact, John Kerry, who has nothing to do with Trump, 2 years ago was talking about not ruling out the nuclear option against Iran, which I think didn't mean getting very angry in a nuclear way. I think he meant military nuclear force. Other parts of the world, Russia, Central Asia, India, Pakistan, China, and whatever, there are lots of fracture and fragility points. But there is a growing recognition that you can only win if you cooperate together. Pakistan and India is a particularly tricky one in that sort of model. But that growing levels of dialogue, the attempts to try to cooperate together, including even increasingly in places like Afghanistan, where levels of local commitment have been relatively low and have gone wrong. But increasingly, the part of the world from Turkey east is seeing that the West talks and doesn't act. And when it does act, it makes bad decisions, and they're not just bad decisions today, it's the same mistakes again and again and again. And it's boring being a historian saying that you need to learn from history, because it's trite and it's sort of, but the problem is it comes back to levels of education and knowledge. And when you have parliaments who don't have MPs who speak these languages, who don't know anything other than what they've learnt about Lord Salisbury and the reform laws and the First and Second World War, and their focus of vision is Henry VIII, and doesn't go any further into the past, then it's not surprising that the rest of the world is trying to work out what does Europe and the US actually represent other than consumers.
So when people, part of what drives people's perception, whether it's leaders or ordinary people on the ground, is which system looks like it's the most successful. And right now, it must look for lots of, as it were, people around the world thinking about where their allegiances are going to form, that actually authoritarian regimes seem to be much more effective than democratic regimes.
Well, I think we in the West have all been I was brought up thinking democracy is a bit like asking at the end of a meal who wants tea and who wants coffee, and if more people put their hands up for one, it's tough. You take your too bad. You have an election in 4 years' time, and if you don't like it, then you have a different. I think this idea that democracy can divide has come as a real shock to people here. I think that those of you involved in the business world know that organisations tend to work with a single leader at the top, and they're top down. The good organisations engage with the bottom up, they listen and so on and so forth. But leadership is very hard when you have multiple voices. And poor Theresa May had to juggle multiple constituencies. The EU, the idea of having 27, 28 nations trying to reach decisions together, we realise that these are a fundamental part of our fragility. And in all those countries that I mentioned, Turkey, Central Asian republics, Russia, China, none of these are fully functional, well, they're not functional democracies at all. Their ideas about human rights, about tolerances, are on a different scale to ours, but that might just be that we're on a matrix heading in different directions. When I was in Central Asia earlier this year, it's pointed out very pointedly that, it was pointed out very carefully that Kazakhstan's GDP has gone up 80 times in the last 25 years. And wealth, and it's one of the themes of my book, wealth breeds prosperity and breeds tolerance. If you think you can put food on your children's table and their life is going to be better than yours, hard work, all those things that we are used to in Britain in the last 300-400 years, that all comes together because there's a purpose. But when societies start to narrow because there is economic contraction, and the gentleman asked, can we just fix the economies? The fundamentals here are that we can't keep growing. There are not the mechanics, there are not the people. And if automation, something I know you look at here a lot, is even at 20 or 10% of what the predictions are in the next 10 to 15 years, we in Europe, we are not able to compete. And that flow of movement of GDP out of the developed economies into what's all called the emerging markets, which means basically anywhere doesn't have English as a second language at school. We are out of position. And here, there are ways in which our little rock in the North Atlantic can prosper with very careful, pointed thoughts. And I've been very careful not to write anything in the press about that, about where Brexit has worked in the past, because there are cases where you can stay on that door, and the Titanic, as I'm mixing lots of metaphors, and survive. But it needs to be planned, there needs to be a vision, and you start with your education.
Matthew, people's attitudes to globalisation. I remember years ago you could go to an audience of very left-wing people and they'd all say we're anti-globalisation. And you'd say, well, where were your trainers made? And they go, oh, well, that's a bit embarrassing. So what do we know about public attitudes to globalisation and the kind of and people's, there's a general view that people are pulling back from it. But people are contradictory. They want to travel abroad, they want to buy stuff from all over the world, and then they say, but globalisation isn't working.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, take Britain as an example, or it's also true across much of Europe, I mean, the reason that I think we've seen so much volatility in the political world recently is you've now got a significant number of voters who are economically left-wing in their views toward the markets and the global economy, who say they want redistribution, they feel there's one law for the rich, another for the poor, they feel that the workers, getting done over by the boss, they feel essentially life's unfair, but also on social and cultural issues, very right-wing. And that goes some way to understanding why in April we'll all be talking about Marine Le Pen in the second round of the French presidential elections, because she's economically protectionist. She's spending as much time talking about what's wrong with the banks and McDonald's and Starbucks and people not paying, corporations not paying tax, as she is about the threat to the French nation. So you've got that.
Because that sounds like a slam dunk for nationalism. Because if you want that mixture of a kind of a left-of-centre economic programme which says we've actually got a kind of, we're anti-global capitalism, but you also want a right-of-centre cultural agenda. Nationalism does tick both boxes, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, one interpretation is it's a slam dunk. It's a strength for nationalism. Another is, it's a big problem for social democrats because they're only speaking on one of those dimensions. They're only speaking to the economics of it, the sort of living wage, protect the workers. They're not talking to the identity bit. So they're continually getting outflanked on that second dimension. And that's where you see, the remarkable moment for me in 2016 was the Austrian elections, where the day after the Austrian elections, everyone was on social media, a few people on social media celebrating the fact that Hofer had got 46% of the vote and the Liberals had won. And I was thinking back to 2002 when Jean-Marie Le Pen got 18% of the vote in the second round of the presidential elections, and it was a global shock. But we've now got into this position, I'm going slightly off-piste here, but we've got into this position where actually 46% for a party that makes very critical remarks toward globalization, very critical toward Islam, is very popular among young Austrians, something that everybody overlooks because of this argument that the angry old white man's going to fade over the horizon and the new liberal young majority is going to emerge. There are lots of cases in Europe where that simply is not true. But that for me was a moment in 2016 that was a real kind of eye-opener, that we have now completely lost sight of the extent to which nationalism is winning across multiple fronts in this ideological war. So I was listening to you, I was slightly depressed being sort of in the House of the West thinking, crikey, we're going over the sunset. And I tried to offer a ray of hope earlier, but unless we start thinking about how to make an aggressive intellectual case, we can sit around and talk about the problems with nationalism all day long. But on many of these fronts, they seem to be winning.
I've heard it said that there's one thing more frightening than America trying to provide leadership to the world, and that's America not trying to provide leadership to the world. Yeah. Reflect.
Yeah, well, indeed. I don't feel very sanguine about the leadership that America is about to provide to the world for fairly obvious reasons, some of which I've already articulated, many of which are implicit. And yeah, I mean, it's a very unknown quantity. We face a very, very uncertain future because this is going to be a very real, we all can see that. There's going to be a very real shift in power, and there's going to be a very real shift in large-scale value systems. And it is hard to know how that is going to play out if America steps back. But again, America has been isolationist in the past. It hasn't gone well for either America or the world that it tried to withdraw from when that happened, because of course America is a part of the world, and then it belatedly realizes, oh hell, a world war is happening, we better come in and take all the credit. But
won't Trump naturally, because of his personality, not be satisfied now with leading America? Won't he be starting to think, oh, there's a new stage for me now to try to bestride?
Look, if there's one thing that I'm very happy to say, it's that I don't understand how Donald Trump's mind works, and I don't, and it would be very, very worrying if I did, because it would mean I was psychotic. Look, I don't know, because it's very difficult to tell, all flippancy aside, it's very difficult to tell where these very unstable personal tendencies about narcissism and about his need for adulation at all cost, his demagoguery, his wanting to do a victory tour, and all of that kind of stuff, where that hits up in his own psyche against his opportunism and against his pragmatism. He clearly has that too. And I don't think we don't have enough data points.
When you're in power, you're not in control of events in the way. When you're campaigning, you can determine what the agenda is.
Yeah.
You can't.
Indeed.
If South Korea invades North Korea tomorrow, he can't say, well, I'm going to have a press conference about Muslims,
Well,
because
he
he's got to respond
because
to that.
he does all of those things. And so he's already, I mean, that is what he does. So the question is, of course, and we haven't even addressed this yet, is who's really going to be in charge? I think there's a very strong argument that Pence is going to be running the show, while Trump is looking after his business interests and or on the golf course. Whether he can, get away with that, I think that's what the GOP hoped he would do, because that was their safe bet, was that he could just be the puppet and they could, go about business as usual. He's such a loose cannon, I don't think they can trust him to do that. I don't think any of us can trust him to do that. So I think he really is an unknown quantity in a very real sense. And I think that the people who are kind of cheerfully saying that the American system will kick in and limit him, well, let's hope so. But he's not even in power yet. And, people are slipping up and calling him the president, and people are, and he continues to dominate the political narrative in a way that is that is very, very worrying, even just as an indicator of where we might be heading. Can I just say one other thing about the education, though, which I think is really important, because Peter's making the point about experts who and absolutely, that we need to come back to a point where we respect expertise, both academic expertise, but we respect experiential expertise. We respect expertise where we find it across society, but we understand that in order to solve these problems, we need experts who speak languages, as you said, who understand comparative religion, who do all of those things. And to me, on the level of education, it's not a coincidence that we've been talking for a decade or so about how the only thing we need to teach are science, technology, medicine, and maths, and the humanities are a luxury we can't afford. Well, this is where we end up if we think the humanities are a luxury. We have a government that actually can't solve the problems that it is confronted with, whether or not it has created those. So I think we have to understand where all of the expertise comes from that we can bring to try to address these issues.
I think you'll find a lot of people in the room have a lot of sympathy with that.
Well, it is the RSA. I know, I'm preaching to the choir.
It is the RSA. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I'm going to do something completely unscientific. Maybe you have to forgive me for this. I want to ask you, you could tell me, do you think that at the end of 2017, you'll say it was a better or a worse year than 2016? So those of you who think at the end of 2017, you'll say it was an even worse year than 2016, put your hands up. And those who think you'll say no, it was a better year than 2016. No, we are just about on the side of hope. Thank you all very much. I'm sorry that we couldn't have more questions, but the ones that you asked were great. I think we've definitely got Sarah's book and Peter's book outside. Have we got Matthew's book outside? We haven't got it, but it's available on an exploitative website. Don't quote me, for goodness sake, on saying that. Okay, so thank you all for coming. It only remains for me to ask you to thank our wonderful panel, Matthew Goodwin, Sarah Churchwell, and Peter Frankopan. Thank you.